The blood-stained diary fell from Scarlet Winter's trembling hands as she read the words that would shatter every belief she'd ever held about her life. Today I told another lie to my precious daughter about her father. Richard Blackthorne thinks she's dead, just like I told him she was when I fled with his child 19 years ago. But God help me, I see his eyes in her face every single day, and the weight of this deception is killing me faster than the cancer ever could. The leather-bound journal hit the dusty attic floor with a sound like thunder in the suffocating silence, and Scarlet felt her entire world collapse into the space between one heartbeat and the next. Everything she thought she knew, her name, her father's identity, her mother's character, her very existence, had just been revealed as an elaborate lie constructed by the woman she trusted more than anyone else in the world. 3 hours earlier, Scarlet had climbed into this same attic to sort through her mother's belongings after the funeral, expecting to find nothing more significant than old photographs and forgotten Christmas decorations. Celeste Winters had been the picture of maternal devotion, a woman who had raised her daughter alone with such fierce protective love that Scarlet had never even wondered about the father who had supposedly died in a car accident before her birth. The story had always been simple, tragic, and complete, a young widow struggling to raise her child while honoring the memory of the man who had given them both so much love in such a short time. But now, with her mother's secret diary open before her and pages of confessions spilling out like blood from a mortal wound, Scarlet realized that every bedtime story, every explanation, every reassurance about her origins had been a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide a truth too devastating for a child to understand. As she forced herself to pick up the diary again with shaking hands, Scarlet discovered that her mother had been writing in it for nearly 20 years, chronicling not just the daily struggles of single motherhood but the agonizing guilt of a woman living with a secret that grew heavier with each passing year. The first entry was dated just 3 days after Scarlet's birth. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I couldn't let him take her from me. Richard has no idea she survived the accident I staged, no idea that his daughter is alive and perfect and sleeping in my arms as I write this. He believes we're both dead, buried in a cemetery in Seattle under false names, and maybe that's better for everyone. He's dangerous, powerful, and he would have taken her away from me the moment he learned she existed. This way, she's safe, and he can grieve and move on with his life. The raw anguish in her mother's handwriting was like a physical blow, but it was nothing compared to the revelation that her entire life had been built on her mother's desperate decision to fake both their deaths rather than face some unnamed threat from the man who was apparently Scarlet's real father. The diary entries painted a picture of Celeste Winters as a woman trapped between love and terror, torn between her daughter's right to know her father and her bone-deep conviction that Richard Blackthorne represented a danger too great to risk. As Scarlet read deeper into her mother's confessions, she learned that Richard hadn't been just any man. He was heir to one of the most powerful and ruthless business empires in the country, a man whose family had a history of taking what they wanted regardless of the consequences to anyone who stood in their way. Celeste had been his secretary, then his lover. But when she discovered she was pregnant, she'd also discovered documents that revealed the true extent of the Blackthorne family's willingness to eliminate obstacles to their desires. I found the files by accident. One entry read, "Contracts with men who make problems disappear, records of bribes to judges and politicians, evidence of lives destroyed for the crime of inconveniencing Richard's father." I knew then that if I told Richard about the baby, she would become a tool in their games of power, raised to be ruthless and empty like the rest of them. So I ran, and I let them think we died in the fire I set in our apartment. It was the only way to save her soul. But as Scarlet continued reading, she began to see cracks in her mother's certainty, moments when Celeste questioned whether she had made the right choice in denying her daughter the chance to know her biological father. The entries from Scarlet's 10th birthday were particularly heartbreaking. She asked me again today why she doesn't have any grandparents, any aunts or uncles, any family at all besides me. I told her the same lies I always tell, but I could see the loneliness in her eyes, the hunger for connections I've stolen from her. What if Richard has changed? What if fatherhood would have transformed him the way motherhood changed me? What if I've condemned my daughter to a life of isolation based on fears that are no longer real? The doubt and self-recrimination in her mother's words made Scarlett's chest tight with a grief she couldn't name, grief for her mother's suffering, for her own stolen connections, and for a man she never met who had spent 19 years believing his child was dead. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the attic floor, Scarlett discovered that her mother's diary contained more than just confessions and regrets. It also chronicled her growing awareness that she might not have been as successful in hiding their identities as she had hoped. The entries from the past 2 years were filled with a paranoia that had apparently consumed Celeste's final months. I saw him again today, the man in the dark coat who's been following me for weeks. I don't know if he's one of Richard's people or if I'm finally losing my mind to the cancer, but I can't shake the feeling that our time is running out. Scarlett is 18 now, old enough to make her own choices, but how do I tell her that everything she believes about herself is a lie? How do I explain that I stole her from a father who loved her before she was even born? The revelation that her mother had been living in fear during her final months added another layer of complexity to Scarlett's emotional turmoil. Had Celeste died believing that their secret was about to be exposed, that the life she had built for them was about to crumble? The answer came in the form of a letter tucked between the diary's final pages, written in her mother's increasingly shaky handwriting and dated just 1 week before her death. My dearest Scarlett, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've discovered the truth I was too cowardly to tell you while I was alive. I know you must hate me now, and I don't blame you. I stole 19 years from you and from a man who deserved to know his daughter. But please understand that every choice I made was motivated by love for you, fear for your safety, and the desperate hope that I could give you a normal life away from the darkness that surrounds the Blackthorne name. Your real father's name is Richard Blackthorne, and if he's still alive, he lives in Manhattan. He has never stopped looking for us, Scarlett. I know this because every year on your birthday, he places an advertisement in newspapers across the country, begging for any information about his missing daughter. He loved you before you were born, and losing us nearly destroyed him. The choice of what to do with this knowledge is yours now. I pray you can forgive a mother who loved you enough to become a criminal, a liar, and ultimately a coward who couldn't face the consequences of her choices. The sound of the front door slamming shut downstairs jolted Scarlett from her emotional paralysis, and she quickly stuffed the diary into her jacket as she heard footsteps moving through the house below. Her stepfather's voice called out, "Scarlett? Are you home?" And she realized with crystal clarity that she couldn't face Thomas Winters right now, the man who had married her mother when Scarlett was 12 and who had been the closest thing to a father she'd ever known. How could she look him in the eye knowing that their entire family had been built on a foundation of lies? How could she pretend that nothing had changed when everything, her identity, her history, her understanding of love and family, had just been turned inside out by words written in her dead mother's hand? She climbed down from the attic as quietly as possible and slipped out the back door before Thomas could find her, her mind reeling with questions that had no easy answers. As she walked through the familiar streets of the small Oregon town where she'd grown up, every landmark seemed different now, tainted by the knowledge that none of it was really home, that she was living in a witness protection program she'd never known she needed. Protected from a father who might be a monster or might be a heartbroken man who had spent 2 decades mourning a child who was actually alive and walking through a world that wasn't supposed to exist. The weight of her mother's diary in her jacket felt like carrying a bomb, and she realized that she now possessed information that could destroy multiple lives, her own, Thomas's, and possibly the man named Richard Blackthorne who had never stopped looking for the daughter he believed was dead. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Scarlett sat at her computer and typed, "Richard Blackthorne," into the search engine with trembling fingers. What she found made her stomach drop into free fall, page after page of articles about one of the most powerful businessmen in America, A man whose empire spanned continents, but whose personal life had been marked by tragedy and isolation. There were photographs of him at charity galas and business meetings, and Scarlett found herself staring into eyes that were unmistakably her own, the same unusual green color, the same slight upturn at the corners, the same intensity that had always made her feel different from her more conventional mother and stepfather. But it was the articles about his personal life that made her hands shake as she read them, story after story about how the death of his pregnant girlfriend and unborn child in a fire 19 years ago had changed him from a ruthless playboy into a man obsessed with protecting families and finding missing children. The Richard Blackthorne described in these articles bore no resemblance to the dangerous monster her mother had painted in her diary. This man had used his wealth and influence to fund missing children organizations, to lobby for stronger penalties for child abduction, and to personally finance search efforts for dozens of families who couldn't afford private investigators. Every year on what would have been Scarlett's birthday, he donated millions to charities in memory of Celeste and the daughter I never got to meet. And he had never married, never had other children, apparently never moved on from the loss that had defined his adult life. Either her mother had been catastrophically wrong about his character, or losing his family had transformed him in ways that Celeste could never have predicted when she made her desperate decision to disappear. As Scarlett scrolled through years of articles and photographs, she found herself building a mental picture of a man who had channeled his grief into a mission to protect other families from experiencing the loss that had shattered his world. But she also found hints of the darkness her mother had feared, business rivals who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, investigations that had been suddenly dropped, and a family history that included everything from political corruption to suspected murder. The Blackthorne name was associated with power, wealth, and a willingness to crush anyone who threatened their interests, but it was also linked to millions of dollars in charitable donations and a personal crusade to reunite missing children with their families. Richard Blackthorne appeared to be a man capable of both extraordinary kindness and ruthless violence, depending on whether you were someone he was trying to protect or someone who threatened what he valued most. The complexity of her biological father's character made Scarlett's choice infinitely more difficult than it would have been if he had been simply good or simply evil. As she sat in her childhood bedroom surrounded by the artifacts of a life built on lies, she realized that she now faced the most important decision she would ever make, whether to honor her mother's sacrifice by maintaining the fiction that had kept her safe for 19 years, or whether to step out of the shadows and claim the identity that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to have a voice in the matter. Either choice would have devastating consequences. Revealing herself to Richard Blackthorne might put her in danger from his enemies or from the darker aspects of his own nature, but continuing to hide would mean living forever with the knowledge that a man was mourning a daughter who was alive and within reach of contact. The decision became even more complicated when Scarlett discovered, buried in the bottom of her mother's jewelry box, a small envelope marked, "For Scarlett's 18th birthday," that contained a key and an address to a safety deposit box in Portland. The contents of that box, accessed the next day during a drive that felt like a journey into an alternate reality, revealed the full extent of her mother's preparations for this moment. Inside were copies of all the documents that had convinced Celeste that Richard Blackthorne was dangerous, contracts with mercenaries, records of bribes and blackmail, evidence of the ruthless methods the Blackthorne family had used to maintain their power. But there were also more recent documents that Celeste had apparently gathered during her final months, including private investigator reports that painted a very different picture of the man Richard had become in the years since losing his family. According to these more recent reports, Richard Blackthorne had systematically dismantled many of his family's more questionable operations, had severed ties with the criminal elements that had once been part of the Blackthorne empire, and had transformed himself into something closer to a vigilante philanthropist who used his resources to protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. The investigators' notes suggested that losing Celeste and their child had been a watershed moment that had fundamentally changed Richard's moral compass, turning him from a man who had inherited a legacy of ruthlessness into someone who was actively trying to atone for his family's past sins. Subject appears to be genuinely committed to his charitable work, one report noted, and has made numerous personal sacrifices to distance himself from the criminal elements of the Blackthorn organization. However, he remains capable of extreme measures when protecting those he considers family, as evidenced by his response to threats against his charitable organization's beneficiaries. Armed with this new information, Scarlett found herself torn between three possible courses of action, each carrying risks that could destroy not just her own life but the lives of everyone she cared about. She could continue living as Scarlett Winters, honoring her mother's sacrifice but condemning Richard Blackthorn to a lifetime of unnecessary grief. She could reveal herself gradually, perhaps through an intermediary, testing the waters to see if the man her mother had feared was truly gone. Or she could take the boldest and most dangerous path, confronting Richard Blackthorn directly and trusting that the love her mother's diary suggested he had felt for his unborn child would be stronger than any desire for revenge against the woman who had stolen his daughter and let him believe she was dead for 19 years. The choice was made for her 3 days later when Thomas Winters sat her down in their living room with tears streaming down his face and handed her a letter that had arrived in the morning mail. "I don't understand what this means," he said in a voice broken by confusion and fear. "But someone knows something about your mother that I never did." The letter was written on expensive stationery and signed simply, R.B., and its contents made Scarlett's blood run cold. "Dear Mrs. Winters, I have reason to believe that the woman who died under the name Celeste Winters was actually someone very important to me who disappeared 19 years ago. If this is true, then the daughter she raised may be my child, stolen from me before her birth and hidden from me through an elaborate deception that has caused me unimaginable suffering. I have no desire to disrupt your family's life if I am wrong, but if I am right, then I have a daughter who deserves to know that her father never stopped looking for her and never stopped loving her. I will be staying at the Portland Ritz-Carlton for the next week. If there is any truth to my suspicions, please contact me. I seek only the chance to know my child, not to punish those who kept us apart." The letter's arrival changed everything, transforming Scarlett's internal dilemma into an external crisis that demanded immediate action. Richard Blackthorn hadn't waited for her to find him. He had found her, or at least found evidence of her existence, and now he was less than an hour's drive away, waiting for confirmation of what he clearly suspected to be true. Thomas was staring at her with growing realization dawning in his eyes, and Scarlett could see him beginning to piece together the implications of the letter combined with her mother's secret of final months, and her own recent strange behavior. "Scarlett," he said slowly, "is there something you need to tell me about your mother? About yourself?" The kindness in his voice, the obvious fear that he was about to lose the daughter he had raised for 7 years, made her decision for her. "I need to show you something," she said, and retrieved her mother's diary from its hiding place behind her bedroom dresser. As Thomas read through the pages of Celeste's confessions, Scarlett watched the man she had called Dad for most of her life grapple with the revelation that the woman he had married and the daughter he had raised were both living under false identities. When he finished reading, he was quiet for a long time before speaking. "I knew your mother was running from something," he finally said. "I could see it in the way she watched the windows, in how she never wanted to travel, in the way she'd sometimes wake up screaming from nightmares she wouldn't talk about. But I never imagined anything like this." His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking as he returned the diary to her. "The question now is what you want to do about it. This Richard Blackthorn is your biological father, and he's clearly been suffering for 19 years because he thinks you're dead. But he's also potentially dangerous, and meeting him could put you in harm's way." That night, as Scarlett lay awake staring at the ceiling, she found herself thinking not about the risks of meeting Richard Blackthorn, but about the cost of continuing to hide from him. Somewhere in Portland, a man was spending another sleepless night wondering if his daughter was alive, If the woman he had loved had survived the fire that had supposedly claimed both their lives, if there was any chance that the grief he had carried for 19 years might finally have an end. Her mother had made her choice based on fear for Scarlett's safety, fear of the Blackthorne family's power, fear of losing the child she had carried and loved and protected with every breath she took. But Scarlett realized that she couldn't make her choice based on fear. Not when she had information her mother had never possessed, not when she knew that the man searching for her had spent nearly 2 decades trying to become worthy of the family he believed he had lost. The next morning, she borrowed Thomas's car and drove to Portland with her heart hammering against her ribs, and her mother's diary clutched in her hands like a talisman. The Ritz-Carlton loomed above her as she stood on the sidewalk trying to work up the courage to walk through the doors and claim the identity that had been stolen from her before her birth. She had called ahead and asked to speak with R. Blackthorne, had been told that he was expecting someone and would meet her in the hotel's private dining room, had been given directions that led her through marble corridors that felt more like a palace than a place where ordinary people stayed. When she finally stood outside the dining room door, she took one last moment to steady herself before knocking. "Come in," said a voice that somehow sounded familiar despite the fact that she had never heard it before, and when she opened the door, she found herself face to face with a man whose features were so clearly related to her own that there could be no doubt about their connection. Richard Blackthorne was taller than she had expected, his dark hair streaked with silver that made him look distinguished rather than old. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. The same green eyes she saw in her mirror every morning, now filled with a hope so desperate it was almost painful to witness. "My God!" he whispered, rising from his chair with movements that seemed uncertain, as if he was afraid that moving too quickly might cause her to vanish like a mirage. "You have her eyes. You have Celeste's eyes, and you have mine too. You're her, aren't you? You're my daughter." "I think so," Scarlett managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper as she stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "I found my mother's diary after she died. She wrote about you, about why she ran, about the choice she made to let you think we were both dead." She held up the leather-bound journal with trembling hands. "She loved you, but she was terrified of your family. Terrified of what they might do to control or use me. She thought she was protecting me by disappearing, but she spent 19 years regretting that choice and wondering if she had stolen something precious from both of us." Richard's eyes never left her face as she spoke, and she could see him cataloging every detail, every expression, every gesture that confirmed what his heart was telling him, that the daughter he had mourned for 19 years was alive and standing in front of him. "What was her name?" he asked, and Scarlett could hear the carefully controlled emotion in his voice. "Your mother's real name, I mean." "She used so many different identities when I knew her that I was never sure which one was really hers." The question surprised her because she realized she didn't know the answer. In all of her mother's confessions, she had never revealed what name she had been born with, what identity she had abandoned when she became Celeste Winters. "I don't know," she admitted. "The diary just calls her Celeste, and that's the only name I ever knew her by. She took that secret with her when she died." Richard nodded slowly, as if this was somehow fitting. "She was always good at keeping secrets. It was one of the things I loved about her. She could be trusted completely with anything that mattered. I just never imagined she would use that skill to hide from me." As they sat across from each other at the elegant dining table, Scarlett found herself studying the man who was apparently her father, looking for signs of the dangerous character her mother had feared and finding instead someone who seemed to be holding himself together through sheer force of will. When she offered to let him read her mother's diary, his hands shook as he accepted it, and she watched him navigate through years of Celeste's confessions with expressions that shifted from pain to understanding to something that might have been relief. "She was protecting you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotions she couldn't identify. "Everything she wrote about my family, about the way we conducted business in those days, it was all true. I was a different person then, Scarlett. I thought power meant getting what you wanted regardless of who got hurt in the process. If she had told me about you, if she had tried to raise you within the sphere of the Blackthorn family, you would have become a tool in games you were too innocent to understand. But you're different now, she said, and it wasn't a question because she could see the truth of it in his face, in the way he spoke about his past with regret rather than pride. The articles I read, the charity work, the way you've tried to help other families, losing us changed you, didn't it? Richard's smile was sad but genuine as he nodded. Losing you destroyed me in ways I didn't know were possible. I spent the first year drinking myself nearly to death, the second year planning revenge against everyone I thought might have been responsible for the fire, and the third year finally accepting that my own choices had created the circumstances that led to your mother's fear. She ran from me because I had given her every reason to believe that I was dangerous, that my family was dangerous, that bringing a child into our world would mean sacrificing that child's soul on the altar of power and wealth. So I decided to become the kind of man who deserved to have a family, even if I never got the chance to have one again. The conversation that followed lasted for hours, with Richard sharing stories of the man he had been and the man he had tried to become, while Scarlett found herself opening up about her childhood, her relationship with Thomas, her mother's love and protectiveness, and her own struggles with identity and belonging. As the afternoon faded into evening, she began to understand that this wasn't just a reunion between a father and daughter who had been separated by deception. It was a meeting between two people who had both been shaped by the same loss, who had both spent years wondering what their lives might have been if circumstances had been different. "I used to dream about you," Richard told her as they shared a quiet dinner in the privacy of the dining room. "I would imagine what you would look like, what your voice would sound like, what kind of person you would grow up to be. I pictured you as brave and kind and smart, someone who would make the world better just by being in it. And now, meeting you, I realized that even my best dreams didn't do justice to who you actually became." But their reunion wasn't without its complications, as both of them were acutely aware of the impossibility of simply picking up where they had left off 19 years ago. "I don't expect you to call me Dad," Richard said as they prepared to part ways for the evening. "Thomas Winters raised you, loved you, gave you everything I should have been able to provide. I'm grateful to him for being the father I never got the chance to be, and I don't want to take anything away from that relationship. But I hope that maybe we can find our own way to be family, whatever that looks like for us." Scarlett felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized that this man she had been taught to fear was actually offering her something she had never expected to have, not a replacement for the father who had raised her, but an expansion of her definition of family that could include both the man who had loved her from infancy and the man who had loved her before she was born. The drive home that night was both the longest and shortest of Scarlett's life, filled with a confusing mixture of joy, grief, hope, and uncertainty that left her emotionally exhausted by the time she pulled into her driveway. Thomas was waiting up for her, and she could see in his face the same fear she had been carrying, the fear that this reunion would somehow diminish what they had built together over the past 7 years. "How did it go?" he asked simply, and she realized that this question would determine the shape of her future in ways she was only beginning to understand. "He's not what Mom feared he would be," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "He's changed, become someone who uses his power to protect people instead of using people to gain power. But that doesn't mean Mom was wrong to run. She made the best decision she could with the information she had, and she gave me something Richard never could have, a normal childhood with a father who loved me just for being his daughter." Over the following weeks, Scarlett found herself navigating the delicate process of building a relationship with Richard while maintaining the bonds that had sustained her throughout her life. Richard, true to his word, made no demands on her time or attention, but offered himself as a resource she could turn to whenever she needed advice, support, or simply someone who understood what it felt like to carry the weight of the Blackthorn legacy. He helped her apply to colleges she never could have afforded otherwise, not by throwing money at the problem but by connecting her with scholarship opportunities and mentorship programs that recognized her potential. He introduced her to extended family members who had spent 19 years believing she was dead, and helped her understand the complex dynamics of a clan that was trying to move away from its dark past while still wielding enormous influence in the world. But perhaps most importantly, Richard gave her something she had never realized she was missing: stories about her mother from before she became Celeste Winters, memories of a woman who had been brilliant and funny and fearless in ways that Scarlett was only now beginning to discover in herself. She used to say that she wanted to change the world, but she wasn't sure how to go about it. Richard told her during one of their weekly dinners. "I think she found her way by raising you. You're everything she hoped you would be, and everything she was before fear changed her into someone who felt like she had to hide from life instead of embracing it." These conversations helped Scarlett understand that her mother's choice to run hadn't been an act of cowardice, but an act of fierce maternal love that had required enormous courage to sustain for nearly 2 decades. The most difficult moment came when Scarlett decided to visit her mother's grave with both Richard and Thomas, creating a scene that would have seemed impossible just months earlier: a daughter flanked by the man who had raised her and the man who had given her life, both of them paying respects to a woman who had shaped all their destinies through choices that had been motivated by love, fear, and an unwavering determination to protect what mattered most. As they stood together in the quiet cemetery, Richard spoke to Celeste's headstone with a voice thick with emotion. "I understand now why you ran, why you thought hiding was the only way to keep her safe. I forgive you for the years you stole from us, because I can see what you gave her instead: a childhood filled with love instead of power games, values instead of ambition, kindness instead of ruthlessness. Thank you for making her into someone I can be proud to call my daughter." Thomas's response was equally moving as he addressed the woman he had loved without ever fully knowing her. "I always wondered what you were running from, what made you so afraid of the past catching up with us. Now I understand that you weren't just protecting Scarlett, you were protecting me too, making sure that our little family stayed safe from forces I never could have handled. I'm not angry that you didn't tell me the truth. I'm grateful that you trusted me enough to let me be part of the life you built for her." And finally, Scarlett spoke to her mother's memory with words that had been building in her heart since the day she found the diary. "You gave me everything you thought I needed to be happy and safe, but you forgot to give yourself permission to be happy too. I hope you can rest now, knowing that your sacrifice wasn't in vain, that Richard became the man you hoped he could be, and that all of us found our way to forgiveness and love despite the complicated path we had to take to get there." As the months passed and their unconventional family dynamic settled into something resembling normalcy, Scarlett began to understand that her mother's legacy wasn't just a lie she had told to protect her daughter. It was the lesson that love sometimes requires impossible choices, and that the measure of those choices isn't whether they cause pain, but whether they ultimately serve the greater good. She had given Scarlett a father who loved her without condition, a biological father who had used loss to transform himself into someone worthy of love, and a mother's example of how to make sacrifices for the people who matter most. "Family isn't just about blood," she wrote in her college application essay about overcoming challenges. "It's about the people who choose to love you even when loving you costs them something. I've been blessed to have multiple people in my life who made that choice, even when circumstances tried to keep us apart." The story of her reunion with Richard Blackthorne eventually became public knowledge, not because anyone sought publicity, but because their relationship inspired Richard to establish a foundation dedicated to reuniting families separated by fear, deception, or circumstances beyond their control. The Celeste Foundation, named in honor of the woman whose choices had led to both separation and eventual healing, became Richard's most important philanthropic work, an organization that helped other people navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of rebuilding relationships that had been interrupted by tragedy, misunderstanding, or deliberate deception. Scarlett became the Foundation's first scholarship recipient, and eventually its youngest board member, using her unique experience to help other young people who found themselves caught between different versions of their own stories. Years later, when people would ask Scarlett about the lessons she had learned from discovering her mother's secret diary and meeting the father she had never known, she would smile and share the wisdom that had been hard-won through months of emotional upheaval and careful relationship building. "I learned that truth is more complex than we want it to be," she would say. "My mother lied to me for 19 years, but her lies were motivated by love and fear in equal measure. My father was potentially dangerous, but he was also capable of transformation and redemption. My stepfather was hurt by deceptions he had never been part of, but he chose forgiveness over resentment. None of us were entirely right or entirely wrong. We were just people doing the best we could with incomplete information and complicated emotions. The real miracle isn't that we found each other despite all the obstacles. It's that we found ways to love each other because of them." Her relationship with Richard deepened over time, evolving from the tentative connection of two strangers who shared DNA into the genuine affection of two people who had chosen to make room for each other in their hearts. He never tried to replace Thomas as her father, but he offered her something equally valuable, a connection to a larger story, a family history that included both triumph and tragedy, and the knowledge that she had been wanted and loved even before she was born. Thomas, meanwhile, found unexpected friendship with the man who had unknowingly shared his daughter for 7 years, and their relationship became a model for how complicated family situations could be navigated with grace, maturity, and mutual respect. The most profound change in Scarlett's life wasn't the addition of a biological father or the expansion of her family tree. It was the realization that she had inherited something precious from both the mother who had raised her and the father she had never known. From Celeste, she had learned the fierce protective love that would go to any lengths to keep the people you care about safe from harm. From Richard, she had inherited the capacity for transformation, the ability to take the worst experiences life could offer and use them as fuel for becoming someone better, someone worthy of the love that others had invested in her. And from Thomas, she had learned that family was ultimately about choice, about the daily decision to show up for each other, support each other's dreams, and create a home where everyone could be their authentic selves without fear of judgment or abandonment. As she stood at her college graduation, surrounded by all three of the parents who had shaped her life in different ways, Scarlett felt a profound sense of completeness that had nothing to do with having all the pieces of her story and everything to do with understanding that love was large enough to contain contradictions, strong enough to survive deception, and generous enough to make room for everyone who was willing to choose growth over grudges. The secret diary that had shattered her world had ultimately become the key to rebuilding it in a way that was stronger, more honest, and more beautiful than anything she could have imagined when she first climbed into that dusty attic and discovered that everything she thought she knew about her life was just the beginning of a much larger and more magnificent story. The inscription she eventually had engraved on her mother's headstone captured everything she had learned about love, sacrifice, and the courage required to protect what matters most. Celeste Winters, beloved mother who chose love over fear, sacrifice over safety, and her daughter's future over her own peace of mind. Her greatest lie became our greatest truth, that family is not just about who gave you life, but about who helps you live it with courage, grace, and unwavering love. But perhaps the most important lesson Scarlett learned from her journey through deception to truth was that redemption is always possible, no matter how far someone has fallen or how deeply they have hurt the people they love. Richard Blackthorne had started as a man capable of inspiring terror in someone as strong and resourceful as her mother, but he had transformed himself into someone worthy of trust, respect, and eventually love. Celeste had begun as someone willing to fake deaths and steal identities, but her motivation had always been the protection of her child, and even her deceptions had been acts of profound love. Thomas had been lied to and deceived by the woman he married, but he had chosen to see those lies as evidence of how desperately she had wanted to protect their family rather than as betrayals of his trust. The final entry in her own journal, written on the 5-year anniversary of finding her mother's diary, reflected the wisdom that had grown from pain, confusion, and ultimately acceptance. I used to think that truth was simple, that something was either honest or dishonest, right or wrong, good or evil. But I've learned that real life exists in the spaces between those absolutes, in the gray areas where people make impossible choices with imperfect information and hope that love will be enough to heal whatever damage their decisions might cause. My mother's secret diary didn't just reveal the truth about my parentage, it revealed the truth about what it means to be human, to make mistakes, to carry guilt, and to love someone so much that you're willing to become a criminal to keep them safe. I am the daughter of a woman who lied to protect me, a man who transformed himself to deserve me, and another man who chose to love me despite learning that everything he thought he knew about our family was built on deception. I am the product of secrets and sacrifice, lies and redemption, loss and eventual reunion. And I have never felt more blessed or more loved in my entire life. The story that began with bloodstains on a diary page and a daughter's world collapsing in a dusty attic had evolved into something far more beautiful and complex than any simple tale of deception exposed. It had become a testament to the power of love to transcend circumstances, the possibility of redemption even after the greatest mistakes, and the truth that families, real families, are not just about shared blood or shared history, but about shared commitment to choosing love over fear, forgiveness over revenge, and hope over despair. In the end, Scarlett realized that her mother's greatest gift to her hadn't been the comfortable lie of her childhood or even the shocking truth of her origins. It had been the example of how to love someone so completely that you're willing to sacrifice everything, including your own peace of mind, to give them the best possible chance at happiness and safety. And in learning to understand and forgive her mother's choices, Scarlett had discovered something profound about her own capacity for love, sacrifice, and the kind of moral courage that allows people to make room in their hearts for multiple truths, conflicting loyalties, and the beautiful complexity of relationships that refuse to fit into neat categories or simple explanations. The secret diary had destroyed her old understanding of family, but it had built something far more precious in its place. A family defined not by the absence of secrets or pain, but by the presence of people willing to work through secrets and pain together, with patience, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to the truth that love, in all its complicated forms, is always worth fighting for.